Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome. Use the chat and let us know where you're tuning in from. It's one of the nicest parts of doing these on Zoom. We'll let people get logged in and then we will get started. So I'm in Seattle. Abra's in Michigan. I think Joe's in DC. Joe? I didn't even ask where Joe was tuning in from. Greensboro, North Carolina. Greensboro-ish, North Carolina. DC. Oh, yes, Joe, you are in DC. Good. That's what I thought. All right. So excited to talk about grist. Give it a few more seconds and then we'll get started. Alexandria, Virginia. Hello. East Coast is showing up tonight. All right, Seattle people, where are you? I know you're there. Cincinnati, Ohio. Okay, we're working farther west. This is good. Seattle, thank you. Thank you, Megan. Rebecca in Seattle. Okay, I feel better now. I'm not alone. All right, great. So many Seattle, San Francisco. Amazing. All right. Okay, so it looks like we're leveling off there and more people will join us as we go, but we're going to go ahead and get started. Hi there, welcome. I'm Laura Hamilton. I have a cookbook shop here in Seattle, Washington called Book Larder. We are just starting to do a few in-person cooking classes and very slowly dipping our toes back in the proverbial water with doing in-person author talks with some local authors. But for the time being, we are still enjoying getting together with authors on Zoom and welcoming all of you from all over the place to these talks. So tonight, I am so delighted to welcome Abra Berens as we discuss her absolutely wonderful new book, Grist. I was just like fangirling at her a little bit over it before we got started because I mean, it genuinely is one of my favorite books of this fall season. And it officially comes out tomorrow. If you pre-ordered it from us and had it shipped, it went out over the weekend, so you'll get it real soon. And you'll get a signed copy as well. We are going to obviously talk about the book with Joe Yonan, who is of the Washington Post and the author of several books, most recently Cool Beans. They are going to talk about grist, they're going to talk about beans and grains and answer your questions. So if you have those, feel free to use that little Q&A button at the bottom of your screen for questions that you have for Abra and Joe, and we will get to those towards the end of the talk. You can support the talk by ordering grist from Book Larder, and I know lots of you have done that already, so thank you for that. Your copy, as I mentioned, will be signed. Abra was good enough to send us book plates, and so you will get a signed copy of the book. We are also recording this talk, and so it will be available on YouTube within the next couple of days. Everyone who registered will get an email letting you know that it's available. So if you have to drop off early or you want to share it with other people or even just watch it again later, you can do that. All right, so we're going to get started then. Please join me in welcoming Abra Berens and Joe Yonan.
Hey, thank you, Laura. Hi, everybody.
Thank you so much.
So, Abra, I also started fanboying a little bit in the pre talk, and we came on a little bit earlier because I just love your work, and we've talked before, and I feel like we obviously have some interests in common. But I thought that maybe I would start by asking you to talk a little bit about the title, because I think that it reflects a lot of your, I bet that it reflects a lot of your thinking on the subject, especially because it has multiple meanings, you know, the more literal one and the more kind of metaphorical, figurative one. So yeah, I just want to hear a little bit about how you settle on the title and what you think it says about your subject that you wanted to say.
And I just want to say thanks so much for doing this too, Joe. I mean, we've talked, at length, and I just love your writing, and you're so thoughtful and well-researched. And truly, for those of you who haven't looked at Cool Beans, I mean, I couldn't have written this book done in such an informed way without your work that came before it. So thank you for doing that.
I thank you for saying that.
But It's the truth. So yeah, the title, I mean, I like jokes. And so, Roughage was definitely kind of tongue in cheek and kind of pulling this idea that we're like supposed to eat a lot of vegetables and it can be sort of like taxing for people. And so to kind of like make light of that. And it was sort of the same thing for Grist. I actually wanted to call the book Fodder. After like farm animals and what they have to eat, but then that was quickly poo-pooed in my household. And so we started looking up at like synonyms to fodder, and grist. It was a little bit hard because I wanted it to bridge both the beans and legume side and also the grain side, and grist kind of felt like it was for that. You could make a pun on grist mill or grist meal. It just kind of felt like that. But then also this idea of, taking a whole grain, running it through a mill, making flour, and then making something else out of it, and trying to showcase that versatility. So that's where it comes from. And then, it sort of continues my plan of making things sort of sound unpleasant, but that, are.
I love your wordplay. One of the first things that made me laugh when I was looking through the book was pot liquor, which I just loved. Licker. Made me laugh.
There's something about the way that I hear words. This happens a lot. Like my husband's a musician and he has a song called Ball Cry Whale. And I thought it was like BALL cry and then whale like a sea mammal, but it's not. It's 3 synonyms for crying, and I was just
whale. Okay. Ball cry whale. Okay, I was with you.
That's what I think. But so that comes up a lot, and it was one of those things that that specific story. I used to write a food column for the Traverse City local paper, and I had only ever heard people say pot liquor, and I never saw it read anywhere. And so, I just put it in LICKR, and I got this like scathing email from someone who was just like, "You are such an idiot. It's clearly LIQU," and I was like, "Oh, I had no idea."
But you pull it around, right? It's the kind of thing that makes you want to lick the pot. So I actually have come around to preferring your spelling. I thought that I'd also ask you just to talk about the connective tissues between the two main pillars of your book, between grains and legumes. When you were thinking about this topic, what were you thinking about in terms of how they connect to each other and why you wanted to showcase them together?
I think that for me, they seem to serve similar purposes in my cooking a lot of ways, in that they are hearty and filling and kind of texturally very similar in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. But I think honestly, this book is so informed by the 2 growers, Wesley Reith and Andrew Harris at Grainer Farm where I work, who run our grain program. And we went from about 10 acres of grain when I started there in 2017 to just shy of 400 acres. Wow. And that's small grain and some edible beans and heirloom corns and things like that. So it's a really remarkable thing, especially in our area, because most growers in this area are growing corn and soy, mm-hmm. Or they're growing something totally different, but there's not very many people who are growing small grain. And so because they also grow beans and some non-GMO and heirloom soy, and it's not heirloom soy, but it's a non-GMO soy, mm-hmm. They kind of were linked in my mind. And it felt like a lot of these things are they take up the same space in my kitchen as well. I mean, you can see behind me, this is how I store my grains and legumes, and they, they're pantry staples, whereas Roughage was so much about not exclusively seasonal vegetables, but vegetables that I think of as more of having a season, or, they kind of come in and out of your kitchen in this way. And these things were the staples.
Right.
And so I knew that I wanted to do another book about primary ingredients. And so this kind of seemed like the next step. But yeah, it was really working with the grains coming out of Grainer Farm, and places like Rancho Gordo and Anson Mills, and my cousin grows black beans. So the first time my dad brought me, he only seems to ever show up with like a 30-pound bag of and so I was like, that's a lot of black beans. But yeah, realizing how different of an ingredient they were than what I was getting at the store.
Right. And they meet on the plate so beautifully too. Of course,
exactly.
I love the cover. I love the picture of the grains and the picture of the beans, and then the dish using both. I think it's just elegant and
thank you. Yeah, Sarah Schneider did the design work on it, and I just love kind of how it came together. And I love that. But yeah,
it's quite beautiful.
The other thing, sorry to interrupt, the other thing I thought was interesting that I was hoping we could touch on too is, when I started realizing I did these notes boxes that are quick little kind of like cheat sheets sort of for each one, and realizing that even something like rice, which we think of as a carbohydrate, we don't think of it as a protein. It has, I forget what it is now, but it's like 3% protein or something. And I feel like so often beans and legumes get kind of not quite pigeonholed, but their emphasis is so much on the protein aspect. And when I was like, oh, but wheat has protein, that's the gluten, or like all of these things have some form of protein. And so they're not so totally different, but.
Right. That protein carb combo that you write about so well. Yeah. I love how really from the beginning of the book, the very first words of her intro are, for me, the best meals come from ingredients I'm excited to prepare. And yet I think a lot of cooks probably would read that and think about the kinds of ingredients that were in roughage, right? They would think, oh, super seasonal, like the first really good summer tomato, or the apple in the fall that tells me that it's fall, or ramps or whatever. So tell a little bit about why grains and beans are that for you, are the ingredients that excite you.
I think I'm actually just looking through your book right now to find, there's an image that I've always loved. It's this one. And it's like that spread of all of the different ones from Cool Beans that, just like looking at those Christmas limas, I think.
Yeah. I find those exciting, definitely. Yeah.
They're so beautiful, and they're so like tactile and textural in this way. And so I do think that I don't know that I would have written Grist without having experienced some of those ingredients, that if it were about kind of like the bottom of the shelf, average pinto or kidney bean, I don't know that I would have felt that excited about it. So I think we have a lot to thank of the folks who have been working on an artisan grain movement and bean movement as well for years. I don't remember when Rancho Gordo started. But like it's over 20 years ago, I think. Certainly. And same for Anson Mills.
Right.
And then I think too, this book is so informed by, it was written in the winter of 2019 and spring of 2020. And so much of it is informed by the food shortages that we saw with the pandemic, and how, there were shortages in lots of different places, but when suddenly we don't have flour on the shelves, that feels much more, like apocalyptic than if there's not radicchio on the shelf.
Right.
I think I'd find that anyway. So
I can wait till next week. Right.
Exactly. Yeah. But I do think that there was something so visceral about those shortages. And then to see kind of how that created this gap for the regional millers, at least in our area. It was wild. Like, Holly Wepking at Meadowlark Organics, and I know Harold down at Janie's mill, they were running their mills 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, just to try to get these ingredients into people's homes to fill that gap, and not in a capitalist sense, but just in a like food security sense. And so I think that there was something about that where suddenly they had some shine. And and then there's also like the Bean Club, I think, did a ton for beans, and yeah,
the cultiness. Yeah. You're right about being a little bit worried or horrified at the trendiness of beans on Instagram, and someone wearing a bean shirt and worried that beans might go the way of kale.
For those of you who haven't read that anecdote in the book, the bean chapter opens. There was a day I was like mindlessly scrolling through Instagram and was like, oh, that's nice. It's like someone's cooking a pot of beans. And then it was like, there's another one. And there's another one. And I was like, oh no. And then literally as soon as I thought it, the ad showed up, and it was like a brown sweatshirt with like a brown beans written on it. And I was just like, oh no. But I think hopefully they weather the storm or whatever. But yeah.
I hope so. Because they're too important. So, as an ex-farmer, you bring so much of that to your work, and so much of that sensibility to your work, and you have interviews with farmers in the book, and you talk about the importance of these foods, these crops to growers too. Can you run through some of those, the benefits that you really want people to make sure that they know about with both of those?
Well, I think so. The impetus for those farmer profiles was that roughage is so much about my experience growing vegetables and how it changed the way that I cook. And I was thinking about it, and I was like, how am I going to do this with things that I haven't grown? And then it dawned on me that nobody grows this stuff. People grow it obviously, but like, in our worlds, people who have gardens, they're not growing wheat in their window boxes or in their raised beds. It just doesn't make any sense. And I think that it felt really indicative of some of the scale and agricultural policy and economic policies that really affect growers in a way that most food consumers aren't aware of. And living in farm country, we sort of see that. And so I thought, okay, well, how do I get these farmers' stories into the book? And then it was just like, well, just ask them, and it's like not super revolutionary. So it kind of started with that. And I've been really fixated in our area, because Michigan is such an agriculturally diverse state, how you can have all of these growers in the same region who have vastly different businesses. And so that was the first kind of rundown. Was I interviewed my cousin who, is sort of in that part of the food sector that's hollowing out, of a mid-sized farmer. I think they have about 500 acres, which is a mid-sized farm. And, it's like people are either going really small and selling at farmers markets or, direct to consumer market, or they're growing really big and it's just on the commodities market and this is what they do. And so he's kind of caught in the middle of that. And so I wanted to tell that story and sort of what that looks like. But he's also, a middle-class white man, and who grew up in a farming family. And so that feels like a story that is both, it's very common in the grower world, even if it's not common in the rest of our population's world. But then, look at Jerry Hebron, who runs Oaklawn Avenue Farm in Detroit, who's also a bean grower. Effectively, she grows Crowder peas, but her farm is like, 6 city blocks, and it's grown for a totally different purpose. And she comes at it from a totally different mindset and has a totally different market. And they're both Michigan bean growers. And so I just wanted to show that it is a diverse population, which is I don't know that people interact with farmers that much to know that. And then as we got going, it was sort of like, well, who else has those comparisons? And so I was like, well, I don't know anything about growing rice. So let's talk to a rice grower. And then how is that different from wild rice, which is foraged, and the difference between a foraged crop and a cultivated crop. So those are two of the interviews. And then there's also a lot of invisible jobs kind of along the way. And so for me, that was someone like Carl Wagner, who we work with at Grainer, who's an agronomist and also a seed cleaner. And he cleans all the seed for us, so and I didn't even know that job existed until I started at Grainer. So, there's a giant barley field, for example. It goes through the combine, it's pulled off the plant, it has the chaff removed, all in that giant machine. But then it still has like weed seed, damaged kernels, it still has the barb on it. So it has to be, cleaned and separated from the weed seed, dehulled, pearl, like there's so many steps along the way. So I wanted to include him in that. And then also Hallie Wepking from Meadowlark, who's a miller, and sort of like how this works and how we get from, wheat on the plant to a bag of flour in our store shelves. So that was the idea, was to try to develop both awareness raising and also just some empathy for what these people are doing. And I mean, to be honest, I guess I kind of thank Mike Bloomberg for it, which is a sentence I actually never realized I would say. But he made that comment about how hard can it be to be a farmer? You just stick a seed in the ground, and it was like, you have no idea. And and he's a smart, capable businessman, and to have a business model where I think Rachel Roche, the rice grower in Louisiana, talks about it the most. But she harvests her rice in late July, early August, Louisiana heat, it's all done, it's physical work. And then it gets sold to a commodity like buyer who gives her a price for it, but then she has to store it and absorb the risk of holding that inventory until they potentially come and pick it up in May or June. And if there have been rice weevils, or if, mold got into those grain bins or whatever, they can change the price, they can change how much they're buying. And she's already, 3 months into planting rice for the next year based on that. And so it's a very difficult system. And I think that Nicole Hannah-Jones's piece, the 1619 Project, talks about this with the discrimination against Black growers. And I think you can't underestimate how difficult cash flow is, and what impacts that has on intergenerational wealth and things like that. So it gets real heavy real fast.
Yeah. Well, to stay with the heaviness for just a minute, what do you think are the environmental arguments for consumers to love these ingredients even more than they might, already? Like, what's that connection between? I know your work is so much about like how is it put in your bio, like shortening that distance between grower and eater. So what's in it for or what's the motivation for the eater from an environmental perspective? What does my bringing more of these into my diet, what does that do for the planet?
I mean, I think a lot of things, and you can kind of pick where you want your entrance point to be. So in our region, the fact that we have a market for organic small grain to start having a more diverse agricultural system is a big deal. Because it means that there's improved soil health, which has direct implications on waterways and on the general overall like plant and animal diversity scape. We have different bugs because of it, which is a positive. So I think that I'm generally in favor of more diversity. And so anything that helps incentivize that for growers feels like a positive.
Mm-hmm.
And then also, I think that, you know, there is meat in this book. I eat meat.
Yep.
And so I didn't want to leave it out. But I also think that people are becoming very aware of how meat impacts our agricultural carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions. And so if someone were to feel as excited about those Christmas lima beans as they are about like a steak dinner, you know, then there's actual desire more than just the shoulds of eating to get people to want to make those changes. And maybe it's something where they're leaving meat out for a day a week, or they're going to, you know, supplement their food income, you know, their food budget with some of these other lower price, even the fanciest beans and grains are like they're very affordable.
Wow, so cheap.
Yeah, you know, and so then it's like, okay, if you still want to eat a lamb crown roast, then you can do that and you have a little bit more money to do that, and you can spend it on a different producer. So that feels like a positive. And then also I just think, like, you know, it's sort of like what we were talking about with the regional milling. The whole industry has been very consolidated. And so if you go to your farmer's market and you find someone who is selling, you know, an array of small grain or beans and legumes, they're not working with those giant processors that someone like a Mahatma Rice is working with. And so that then encourages the expansion or the redevelopment of that infrastructure, which does a lot to promote, you know, rural jobs and also just food sector jobs. And so that means that then we're kind of pulling some of those emissions out of some of the urban centers and having a repopulation of this region, which feels really important. It's not exactly environmental, but feels economic in that way.
Yeah. No, you have a really beautifully admirable egalitarian streak through the book, which I really love. So I want to hear a little bit about what you think some of the obstacles are in terms of misconceptions that you think people have about grains and beans, and how you get people past them. You talked about, you know, a sexy bean like the Christmas lima. But yeah, is there anything else? Like, what do you tend to hear people stumble over, and how do you sort of pull them across that line?
I mean, I do think that a lot of these ingredients still have kind of that like health food store sort of, I don't know if taint is the right word, but that's the one that comes to mind. You know, and this idea that like, it means that you can't have any salt on it, that you can't have any fat on it, you know, that there's some sort of piety associated with eating them. And so, and also just that they're compelling, you know, that they have a place in your kitchen. And so I guess that's where, you know, the book it's organized the same as Roughage, where it's each chapter is a primary ingredient. And I always sort of liken it to an NCAA bracket. So it's like, you know, we have the hero of a chickpea, and then we have the preparation techniques, which is, you know, boiled. There's always a boiled, because you can do it with every grain and every legume, and it's delicious.
Love it.
Boiled, stewed, fried, flour, and then say green or whatever, because that one has a green state that's really pleasant.
Right.
And then within that subsection of the preparation technique, there's a lot of variations. And so, you know, there's always a base recipe to give people like a concrete jumping off point. And then there's at least 3 different variations on it. And that was true for Roughage It did not have a seasonal component in roughage because the produce often had its own seasonality. And with these ingredients, I mean, they have seasons, they have a time when they're harvested and a time when they're planted. But that's not how they function in our kitchens. They, they're a dried staple. And so without explicitly articulating this, each one of those variations is, spring, summer, winter, fall. And so that way it's like, oh, in theory, you're going to pair it with these things. And I think a lot of it too is like, I don't know, maybe like when you hear the phrase grain bowl, like, what do you think of?
Yeah, well, that's such an interesting question. In cookbooks, I think what I see as a grain bowl is usually a way more intricate series of recipes than I'm able to take on or than I want to take on. I see a lot of recipes for grain bowls where it's 10 sub recipes almost, or I'm exaggerating, but I think of a grain bowl as a base of grains with, I mean, I always, mine always have beans on them. So, with beans and some type of bean and a fresh or pickled crunchy vegetable and some sauce and maybe some sprinkles of something crunchy.
And I think that articulates like what they can be. And I think so many people think of it as like this thing that you have to get through, and so by having those different textures and those different flavors, I think that it can kind of open folks up to this idea that it doesn't have to be just like eating a bowl of oatmeal over and over and over again. So yeah, I think that's the other biggest thing. And I think the other hurdle too, and I'm sure that you've experienced this with Cool Beans, like there's so many, like, do I soak the beans? Do I not? Which ones have gluten? What's the boiling or what's the water proportion, all that stuff. And so I think there's just a tremendous amount of questions about it. And it's interesting. This is the first book where I have felt, a little bit more aware of the role of food media and being like, is this even compelling for folks? Like, does anybody need these recipes? And then somebody will be like, oh yeah, I can't eat buckwheat because it has gluten. And it's like, oh no, buckwheat actually doesn't have gluten. It's just a misnomer. And so it does still feel like we're having a lot of those conversations that's easy to gloss over when you're dealing with these ingredients every day for, 10 hours a day or whatever. But I think for a lot of folks, they're still not necessarily common staples in their homes.
Right. Well, I have to say, you have just a wonderful way of kind of cutting through a lot of the confusion when you're writing about these ingredients. I think the promotion of boiling for grains is a huge, wonderful, important point to get across to people, because it just makes things accessible. It just really does. And I think a lot of people don't quite, if they didn't come from a culture, I'm my background is Middle Eastern, and we come from a culture with rice and other grains where we boil the grain, and then if we make a pilaf, we then put it in the oven and finish it in the oven and let it steam. And it's a fabulous way to cook grains. And it's so much more foolproof than trying to get the ratio of the water to grain right. And you open it up and you don't understand why there's a little bit extra. You think you have to keep cooking it or whatever. And when you boil, all of those questions kind of disappear.
Yeah. And maybe part of that is that they're all the questions that I had, that like, there was so much more research and kind of puzzling these things out than with roughage, because with roughage, it had become such second nature. And a lot of these ingredients weren't, and the entire wheat chapter is about that like, it's such a complicated family, the wheat family, and it seems to be so every day, but it's not. They're old ingredients, and they've gone through all different parts of the world. And so for those of you who haven't read it yet, the boiling technique is in all of the chapters. And the idea is that I was working at a restaurant I was running, and I asked one of the other cooks, I was like, what's the ratio for rice again? Is it 4-1? Is it 3-1? And she was like, oh, I don't even bother anymore. I just boil it like pasta. And I was like, oh, that's so smart. And then we don't have to rinse it either.
Right.
And then Christina Shea from Bon Appetit had a similar thing. And I was like, oh, we can do this with all of them. And it's great.
Yeah.
And so there's certainly times when you want that actual proportion, if you're stewing something and you want to concentrate all of those flavors of the aromatics and stuff like that, then it makes sense that you'd want to have, not so much liquid left over. You don't want to have to keep checking on it to, I tend to burn stuff because I end up doing more things than I should. And so, that's where it's nice to have that. So that information is in there, but like when in doubt, just treat it like pasta and keep going until it's not like unpleasant to chew. And then you're done. But it's also amazing how fast a lot of these are.
Right.
Like buckwheat cooks in like 12 minutes. It like blew my mind.
Right. It's crazy. I also feel like something about boiling, the window of doneness seems to expand a little bit too. Like you can keep going a little bit more, like a couple minutes doesn't seem to make much. I mean, with some of the grains, it feels huge. Like farro, I feel like, you can keep going and going and going.
Buckwheat less so. Once it's overcooked, once it's cooked, it goes to overcooked pretty fast.
It's cooked. Yeah. Okay. I don't think I've boiled buckwheat before, so I have to do that.
And then you are just eating the grain bowl, like, because I refuse to throw it out. So then it does feel sort of like buckwheat porridge. And I was like, oh, there are a lot of slogging through some experiments. For sure.
Well, one of the things, I'm glad you had brought up the variation and adaptations too a minute ago, because I feel like people who are familiar with your work love that from Roughage. And I just want to make sure that people who don't know your work kind of understand really how impactful that can be in a cookbook. And just, I'm kind of curious about your process for coming up with adaptations and it must just make the testing process just that much more intense, right?
It's messy for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it comes from, I live in rural Michigan. My grocery store, I mean, everything's about 20 minutes away, and the grocery store that we go to the most often is probably 25, 30 minutes away. And so, it really springs from not wanting to like run out to the store, because that ends up being like an hour and a half trip.
Right.
And so I think that, it's about, again, kind of thinking about these ingredients as in their structural side to it, of like, okay, so you forgot to buy feta, but you have like a cheddar or a pecorino or something like that. It's going to be a different texture, but like, it's still a salty dairy. Will it be perfect? It won't be the same, but it'll be pretty good, and like, I guess maybe pretty good is often like good enough for me. So,
absolutely.
And then also, my work at Grainer and again, sort of championing Midwestern food means that we're looking at the ingredients that we grow here and thinking about how do we showcase them on a regular basis where it doesn't feel like we're just making the same thing over and over again. And so a lot of it, my cooking style is very influenced by the flavor Bible and that idea that there's like lots of things that go with each ingredient. And so how to kind of think about it in that way. And the variations, I feel like it's been a nut that's been hard to crack with books. I think I first sort of observed it with Tom Colicchio's Mind of a Chef.
Right.
And I love that book, but it's about like, how do chefs think about food maybe differently than a home cook? And so how do we express that and also turn the keys back over to a home cook to say like, you have authority in this case, and you can decide if maybe you prefer it with cheddar versus feta, great, that's even better. And again, I think it's another kind of, I don't know, the idea of there being a silver lining from the pandemic, like, seems a little far-fetched to me, but, I did have a handful of folks reach out and say that they liked roughage before the pandemic, but they really learned how to cook from it during the pandemic because they weren't going to the stores every day. And so it does kind of comes from that. That's the process behind it. And then as far as how the testing goes, it's mostly, so the way that I write the books, and I'd be curious to hear how this works for you, because, I only know the way that I've done it. The books start with a very detailed outline or table of contents. The table of contents functions as an outline for me. And then when I'm writing that, it's literally just like, okay, if I had a bowl of wheat berries, what would I want to put with it? And then I'll write down a bunch of ideas and then kind of hone it and be sure that they fit, with the other recipes. And then there's not just like, it's not just always like pickle liquid dressing and arugula, because that's usually what I put up.
Right.
Just to be a little more. And so, yeah, that's kind of how functionally that works. And then for this book, because again of the seasonal differences from the vegetables, it was about a year of, just taking notes while we were making dinner, and really this is the food that we would eat at home. So.
Right. I think that those come from very different places. Sometimes, like the recipes that you sort of conceptualize from the get-go, and then the ones that are a little more instinctive when you're cooking.
How does that work for you? Like, what's your sort of process? What was your process for cool beans, or how did that function for you?
It was similar in that I knew I wanted to have a certain breadth and variety. And that was hard because for me, there were 10 hummuses in the book, and at first, and there were way too many chickpeas, and the Middle Eastern and Mexican recipes, which are my wheelhouse, were like 80% of the book, and I had to kind of try to fight against that. And we all have our styles. And for me, it was, I can't possibly get enough smoked paprika, and I had to be careful about that, but yeah, similarly, the best recipes came from, like, I would be sort of improvising in the kitchen, and then I wouldn't be writing anything down as I was doing it. And then I would have to make sure I took a lot of notes afterwards. And then the trick was, could I go back and do it again? And actually write a recipe, which is different.
That replicability is a tricky thing that I think people don't always recognize as, it's such a big part of food writing. It takes a lot of time.
It's technical, it can feel kind of technical. Well, I want to give you a chance before we start questions in a few minutes from our participants. I want to give you a chance to, describe some of the recipes in the book that you feel like really exemplify the mission of the book, and sort of what you wanted to accomplish and what you want readers to really take out of it. Are there things that jump out at you?
I think the entire split pea chapter, because before writing it, I ate split peas very begrudgingly because we grow them here. And so it was just like, ugh. But the flavor always just tasted so muddy to me, and kind of like, it tastes exactly like the color seemed to me.
Olive drab, right?
It's like, right. It's like enemy, I only know that word from crosswords, really, but that's the like flavor of ennui to me.
Right.
And so and for some reason, and yet somehow I had like a 10-pound bag of split peas in my house, and was like, why are these here? And so I was just making split pea soup over and over again, and like, really complaining about it. And I was like, wait, maybe I can actually look to some other folks who would make things with split peas, and really looking back at some of the other cultures. And so in each of the notes boxes, there's a note about where the ingredient originated. And that felt important to include because, where these things come from, also there's a cultural understanding of them. And so then it's like, oh, well, that makes sense. And so if there's,
so people can get a sense. Because those are in every chapter and they're really cool. Sorry to interrupt you, Abra.
No, that's great, Laura. And so the information is consistent from notes box to notes box. And so for that one of my favorite recipes in the book is the split pea breakfast fritters, which I mean are really just breakfast fritters because I like them with an egg fried on them.
Right. Yeah. So great. Right. Oh, God.
But you can have them anytime, really, and they make a great appetizer as well. And that is when it dawned on me. It's a kind of a base. Like the base idea is an Indian recipe made with yellow split peas. And this does not have those same flavors in it. It has some pickles ground into the mix. So you make it basically like a falafel where you soak the peas overnight, blend it in your food processor. I think I'm blanking on some of the immediate ingredients, but it's like a little bit of coriander and onion and pickle, which gives it some acidity, which was lifted from a meatball recipe from Alsace that has that acidity into it. And so I think they're so delicious. And it was a way to take this thing that I just felt so like annoyed by and make it something I was really excited about. And then the same thing for the marinated salad. So a lot of the grains and legumes, you cook them and then dress them in a very acidic dressing and let, as they cool, it's a escabeche,
Right.
like you'll pull that into their center. And so you can make a salad out of that feels very, light and bright. So I would say that the split pea chapter is really kind of illustrates what I'd want the book to be, how I'd want people to use it. And then also even something as simple as, the chickpea chapter is like, I love chickpeas so much.
Oh, me too.
So good. But, we use chickpea flour a lot because it's one of our like go-to, there's a bunch of random stuff in the house. We have to eat dinner pretty quickly or one of us is going to be very angry very soon. And so, making soka or farinata, which is just, it's equal parts chickpea flour. And I tend to use soda water because I like the texture of it, but you could use beer or regular water. And then you just make pancakes or like one giant pancake and then top it with literally whatever is else.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, you did that, the hierarchy, or not hierarchy, but all the different textures of chickpea flour and how it turns into different things depending on how much liquid you put in it. And I was in awe of that because I wanted someone to do that. And I thought about doing it myself. And I just thought, I was really glad to see that. It was so smart just to show that it's such a versatile ingredient.
It's such a versatile ingredient. And it's funny because that also came from a mistake where I forgot that it was equal parts one time. And so I added twice as much water to chickpea flour. And then,
yes, thank you, Laura.
And so it was very thin and I didn't have any more chickpea flour. And so I was like, well, now what am I going to do? And so then we had like a random piece of fish. And so I was like, oh, I bet we could make like fish. It was just like a tempura batter, basically.
Right.
And so, yeah, that came from a mistake. And then the really thick fritter that you're actually, sort of molding almost as a clay and pan frying was also a mistake that I made that I ended up really liking. So.
Yeah, I love it. I love it.
Just eat your mistakes and you can
That's right. That's right. That's right. Okay, I've got a few questions that I will throw at you. Okay. This is a big one. Oh man. Best tips to digest beans. I soak for 12 hours and I'm still super gassy later, especially urad dal. Oh, interesting. But I love the beans too much to quit. This is the perfect group for us to answer because I appear in your book.
You do.
Under the head. What is the heading that I appear in your book under?
It's farts.
Exactly.
So I realized, I was like, oh, I have to give Joe credit. And then I was like, if I were like a petty and passive aggressive person, you could really read into it, but it's not intended.
No, I loved it.
Yeah, I mean, so what do you do? Because I basically learned this from you. So, I mean, you should take it.
I mean, I use kombu is one of the things that I do. And my sister had taught me that from her macrobiotic cooking. And then I investigated and researched, and it turns out to actually have a scientific basis that kombu has the enzyme that we lack for digesting beans. So I feel like it helps, and it helps soften them a little bit. But it has the same enzyme as Beano. Kombu does.
That's right, which is what my mom always used. And so like that was sort of my understanding of it. And then our neighbor, Mario Aranda, uses asafoetida, which has a similar enzyme in it. So yes. So long story short, the idea is that it's your gut lacks an enzyme to break down some of the carbohydrates that are the oleosaccharides. Is that how you pronounce it?
Oligosaccharides,
yeah. I've only ever read it in your book. And so then when you feed your microbiome bacteria with a bunch of carbohydrate, just like children, they lose their minds, and that ends up creating gas. So in theory too, you'll start to they'll kind of regulate themselves with time, but that doesn't seem to be foolproof for a lot of folks. So
and it can take a while, and there's a lot of variation among types of beans, I feel like too. But there's other methods that people use. Pressure cooking seems to reduce them quite a bit if you pressure cook them, if you really have problems, but and other things people use. Let's see. Okay. This is a good one because it's an important part of your book. Jennifer asks, can you talk about the visual aspect of the cookbook and how that came together, and what does that working process look like?
Well, I feel really grateful that it's a really fun process. And also it was the same team from Roughage to Grist. And so it's Emily Berger, E.E. Berger, who does the photos, and Molly Hayward, who does the styling. We shot everything in my house. And so it feels very homespun in that way. And it's really, we go through that same outline and we look at it and decide which photos we want to take. And then they really drove the visual aspects of it. In Roughage, it became very clear that we worked well together, and it was a very collaborative creative process. And then it went next level with Grist because we had a bit more time, and also they were both home more because a lot of their work was canceled because of the pandemic. So it's a really amazing thing when the photographer and the food stylist are having communication before the shoot about the different surfaces that they're going to build to bring to your shoot, just because they're interested. And then the illustrations are from Lucy Engelman, who, again, it was about working with her the first time around and recognizing, the really technical skill set that she has and how to leverage that to be more than just aesthetically pleasing. But so when I first kind of went through the book, I wasn't exactly sure how the illustrations would work in. And so then it became like, okay, we knew the infographics would be there, but there weren't a ton. And so it felt like a pretty big jump from Roughage to Grist. So then it was Sarah Schneider and Sarah Billingsley from Chronicle who suggested illustrated portraits of all of the interview folks. And then also these, I wanted to figure out how to include, the plant for these seeds, because all of these ingredients are seeds. So there's so much plant that goes with them. And they had the idea to do these illustrated boundaries around the notes boxes. And man, Lucy just like, when you like work with someone and you're just like, oh my God, you're so talented. I just like sent her random photos of like wild rice and quinoa. And then she made these beautiful, boundaries or whatever, like the one that Laura held up. I'll see if I can find the wild rice wings. It's my favorite.
They're beautiful. Yeah. It's a stunning book.
These,
oh man. That's so
and what
great.
I love about this one is it's how the wild rice is harvested. So it gets so top heavy and then it trickles down to the bottom of the water basin.
Cool.
And then Larry didn't send a photo of himself, so his back is to the.
Oh, that's great. That's great. That's a great solution.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Let's see. Okay. Kate asks, she says, I cannot wait to receive your book. Do you have any thoughts to share on the seed market and how it limits or not the diversity and nutrition of our veggies, beans, and grains?
I can't speak to the nutrition because I'm not a dietitian, and it's sort of out of my depths to go into that. But certainly the diversity, if you don't have access to these seeds or to seeds that are in good shape, it's hard to grow them. And so I think that's where places like Seed Savers in Iowa, and any of these sort of open share, non-patented, non-GMO seeds are really important. And so, yeah, I mean, they're really critical. And the fact that there's like conversation about legislation to prevent seed saving is just like, you can't, I mean, it's the root of so many of these things. And so to take that out of farmers' hands feels really, really sinister to me.
Yes.
And so I think that's another place where by buying a diverse array and creating that market, you're incentivizing its protection.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. Yeah.
There's one from Kikrin that somebody asked on Instagram as well that you should handle. It's the recipes for desserts and baking with beans and grains. There's only a couple of baking recipes in Grist. There's a barley cookie and there's a rye galette, like a galette dough. But I love the ones in Cool Beans. So I was hoping that you could take that one.
Oh, sure. Yeah, one of the things that I think is interesting about beans is that they are able to play so many different parts of the meal, and because they're they're the only food that the USDA classifies as both a protein and a carbohydrate, which I just find so fascinating. And I think people a lot of times, unless you're on a low carb diet and you pay attention to these things, a lot of people forget that beans are, can be starchy. And so that means that they actually can play the role of starch in some baked goods. So yeah, I do use them in a few things, certainly the chickpea flours, but also the adzuki bean. I use the Asian way and a couple of desserts, a red bean, kind of traditional take on a red bean ice cream, and a little brownie. I kind of do a riff on the old black bean brownie that I think a lot of us experienced. Yeah. And if you remember, did you ever make one of those?
No.
Well, I think the original recipe, if I remember right, that kind of got popular was with a can of beans and a box of brownie mix. And I think, and the liquid included in the can of beans, right. I think, and they were dreadful. And so I tried to kind of dial it all back and break it all apart. And I ended up using the adzuki bean instead of the black bean, and put rose water and stuff in it. So it's fun.
Yeah, I never made the original one. I made yours with the first crop of black beans.
You did?
Staff meal at one point, because we cook for the kitchen cooks for the field crew every Thursday.
Oh,
and
cool.
So the first week that we had the beans in, I think I ended up using we had just grown pinto beans, and so I was using that. But yeah,
wow,
similar enough. I think it was a little bit off, but it was like so good. That rose water is so smart.
Cool. Thank you. I appreciate that. Do we have time for one more? Maybe. Let's see. Do you want to talk about resources?
Yeah, so resources, and also there's one about vegetarianism, what percentage it is. I don't actually know what the percentage is for vegetarian recipes. A lot of them are vegan. And then also anything that has meat in it, usually the meat is not integral to the cooking of the beans. So it's something like a wild rice salad with salted plums that has a seared fish with it, and you could certainly make that with anything and just don't use the fish. So it's, unless you're adamantly against having meat, even visually represented, there's lots of things that you can make without the meat too, and just lift it out basically. And also the portions are smaller. So if you're looking to have a lighter meat diet, I did actively scale back the portioning in all of the recipes. So in a standard restaurant scenario, a portion of fish on a menu would be about 6 ounces, and usually for. And so that's
great.
back on them.
Yeah, that's great.
And then for the resources bit, I'm actually glad you asked, because this was something that one of the recipe testers asked for. And I was sort of like, is this really necessary? But there is a sources section that I'm realizing is like, I guess it's 3 pages long. And all of those are places where you can get it via mail order. So they're from all across the country. And they're a mixture of places that are doing beans and legumes, and also a lot of the regional milling systems. And then there's the big boys like Bob's Red Mill and Zingerman's and places like that. But there's a ton of regional ones that are really worth sorting for.
Yeah. Great.
Laura, thank you so much for having us and for creating a bookstore and doing all the work.
Oh my God, absolutely.
Well,
virtual things. It's so much work, and we're so appreciative.
Well, thank you, both of you, for creating such wonderful things for us to get to share with people. So, you're why we're here. So thank you. And it was a really great conversation. Thank you so much.
Sure.
And congratulations again, Abra. Really just such a marvelous book. And everybody needs to have it. Real quick, what are both of you making bean and grain wise around the holidays as we move into that sort of festive time of year?
I can tell you exactly what I'm making. I haven't told you this, Abra, but I want to feature it in the post. I'm making the lentil stuffed acorn squash with sage brown butter, and I'm making it tomorrow for a photo shoot, so I hope that's okay.
Yeah that's so great. I love that recipe.
Come on,
it looks so
good. Yeah. Look at that. Yeah,
stuffing is so fun. It's like, I don't know what it is about like stuffed peppers or stuffed squash or whatever, stuffed tomatoes. I'm like, it's like a little package, but we do a cassoulet most winters at some point, and I think we were just talking about, we've got a seminal birthday coming up in November, so I think we're going to do a big cassoulet round, and I just ordered the cassoulet beans from Rancho Gordo, so I'm very excited about that.
That's great.
Yeah, that sounds perfect.
Great.
How about you, Laura? What are you making?
Well, I have no kitchen, so I'm hoping someone invites us over. And otherwise, I will be making a big pan of macaroni and cheese that I can put in my little convection oven that you see behind me here.
Nice.
And probably a salad.
Perfect.
It sounds,
family eats turkey, so.
Right. There's no turkey in my house usually either. So, but
that's why those things like that acorn squash are so great, right? Because they make such a lovely central dish if you're not eating turkey, but they're a great side if you want.
Or they're a side, right? Exactly.
Yeah.
And
those freeze well too. They take kind of a long time to reheat from frozen. Like it's definitely an hour plus in the oven. But they do freeze really well. So if you find yourself with like 10 acorn squash, you can make a bunch of them and squirrel them away. But
nice.
See, I could make those at the cookbook store.
Yes.
And freeze them, and then I can heat them up in there. Oh, see, I'm so glad we had this conversation. Thank you.
Solved all your problems.
Thank you for solving my personal problem.
Absolutely.
All right, the book is Grist. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and thank you so much, Joe and Abra.
Oh, thank you,
cool
Abra.
Beans, of course.
We have to outnumber. We have to outnumber with Abra.
I'm like, what else I gotta do?
Everyone, have a lovely evening and stay safe and healthy. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks again, Joe.
Thank you.